I'm Jennifer, 34 years old, and I'll never forget the moment my phone rang at 2:47 in the morning while I sat in the surgical waiting room, watching the clock tick away the hours of my grandmother's emergency triple bypass surgery. The name flashing on my screen was Martin Richardson, the senior manager at Pacific Trust Bank, and his first words made my blood run cold. "Miss Lawson, I'm calling about a highly unusual transaction on your grandmother's account. Your sister Veronica just attempted to withdraw $847,000. I need to speak with you immediately." My grandmother Dorothy was lying on an operating table fighting for her life, and my own sister was trying to rob her blind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My relationship with Grandma Dorothy had always been the cornerstone of my life. She wasn't just family, she was my mentor, my safe harbor, and the person who believed in me when no one else did. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, I spent every Saturday afternoon at her modest but immaculate craftsman home in the Laurelhurst neighborhood, learning everything from how to balance a checkbook to how to stand up for myself in a world that didn't always make space for women's voices. Dorothy Lawson was a force of nature, a Chinese-American woman who had built a successful career as a patent attorney back when women, especially women of color, were rarities in the legal profession. She had worked 70-hour weeks, broken through countless glass ceilings, and invested her earnings wisely over 4 decades, building substantial wealth that she guarded carefully and used generously for causes she believed in. My parents divorced when I was 9, and Dad moved to California shortly after, starting a new family and essentially disappearing from my life except for birthday cards with $20 bills tucked inside. Mom worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, which meant Grandma Dorothy became my primary caregiver most afternoons and weekends. Those hours in her kitchen, helping her prepare dumplings while she told me stories about fighting discrimination in boardrooms and courtrooms, shaped who I became. She taught me Mandarin, shared her love of classical music, and instilled in me a fierce independence that served me well when I went to law school myself, following in her footsteps despite the mountain of student debt it required. When I passed the bar exam 3 years ago, Grandma Dorothy was the first person I called, and her proud tears over the phone made every sleepless night of studying worthwhile. My sister Veronica was 5 years older than me, and our relationship had always been complicated. Where I was studious and careful, Veronica was impulsive and charismatic, drawing people to her with an easy charm that masked deeper issues I didn't fully understand until much later. She had dropped out of college after 1 semester, drifting through various jobs in sales and marketing, always chasing the next big opportunity that would finally make her rich. Veronica had married young to a man named Derek who shared her love of luxury and her disconnect from financial reality. They lived in a sprawling house in the West Hills that they clearly couldn't afford, driving leased luxury cars and taking elaborate vacations that appeared constantly on Veronica's social media feeds. I had learned to keep my distance from their drama, focusing on building my own career at a small but respected environmental law firm downtown. Grandma Dorothy's health had been declining over the past year. At 81, she was still sharp as a tack mentally, but her body was betraying her. The heart issues started small, some shortness of breath, occasional chest pains she dismissed as indigestion, fatigue she attributed to getting older. I had been urging her to see a cardiologist for months, finally convincing her after she nearly collapsed during our regular Thursday dinner together. The diagnosis was severe coronary artery disease requiring immediate surgical intervention. The operation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, and I had taken the entire week off work to be with her, staying at her house to help her prepare and driving her to the hospital at 5 in the morning for pre-op procedures. What I didn't know until that phone call from Martin Richardson was that Veronica had been positioning herself for this exact moment for nearly 6 months. While I had been focused on Grandma's health and helping her navigate medical appointments and treatment options, my sister had been executing a calculated plan to gain access to Dorothy's substantial assets. It started innocently enough, or so it seemed at the time. Veronica began visiting Grandma more frequently, something that initially pleased me because their relationship had been distant for years. She would stop by with expensive pastries from the fancy bakery downtown, offer to help with grocery shopping, and engage Grandma in long conversations about family history and old photographs. I thought perhaps my sister was finally maturing, recognizing the value of family connections before it was too late. But there were signs I missed or chose to ignore. Grandma mentioned once that Veronica had asked detailed questions about her banking arrangements, claiming she was worried about elder fraud and wanted to make sure Dorothy's accounts were properly secured. Another time, Dorothy mentioned that Veronica had offered to help update her will, saying she knew a lawyer who could do it much cheaper than Dorothy's longtime attorney. I had gently suggested that Grandma stick with her current lawyer, someone she had worked with for decades and trusted completely, but I hadn't pressed the issue or investigated why Veronica was suddenly so interested in these matters. Looking back, the red flags were everywhere, but I was too focused on medical concerns to see the financial threat developing right under my nose. The transformation in Veronica's attention toward Grandma Dorothy accelerated about 3 months before the surgery. She started calling herself Dorothy's primary caregiver, a laughable claim since I was the one taking Grandma to every doctor's appointment, managing her medications, and staying overnight when she felt anxious or unwell. But Veronica was strategic in her approach, showing up when I wasn't around, gradually building a narrative with extended family members that she was the devoted granddaughter sacrificing her time to care for our aging grandmother. She joined Grandma's church, something Veronica had never shown interest in before, and made sure to be seen at services sitting beside Dorothy, helping her navigate the hymnal and accompanying her to the social hour afterward. The church community, who didn't know Veronica's history, began praising her devotion and commenting to Grandma about how lucky she was to have such an attentive granddaughter. I learned later from Grandma's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, that Veronica had been bringing Dorothy to the bank regularly over those months. Mrs. Patterson had noticed because Veronica would park her flashy white BMW in front of Dorothy's house and help her grandmother into the passenger seat with exaggerated care, making a show of the assistance. At first, these trips were supposedly to help Grandma with routine banking tasks, depositing checks from her pension and investment dividends, reviewing statements to watch for fraudulent charges. But Veronica was doing something far more insidious. She was slowly, methodically working to get her name added to Dorothy's accounts, claiming it was a safety measure so that if something happened to Grandma, someone could access funds to pay her bills and handle her affairs. The staff at Pacific Trust Bank later told me that Veronica had come in at least 8 times over 3 months, each visit building on the previous one, gradually escalating her requests. She brought paperwork she claimed was from an estate planning attorney, though we later discovered these documents were either forgeries or created by some disreputable service she had found online. She spoke confidently about power of attorney and fiduciary responsibilities, using legal terms just accurately enough to sound knowledgeable to bank employees who weren't lawyers themselves. Grandma Dorothy, who was dealing with increasing health anxiety and the mental fog that sometimes accompanies serious illness and multiple medications, signed documents that Veronica presented to her, trusting that her granddaughter had her best interests at heart. Martin Richardson, the senior bank manager who would eventually call me that terrible night, had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with these visits. He had worked with Dorothy for over 15 years and knew her to be sharp, independent, and very private about her financial affairs. Seeing her suddenly acquiescing to her granddaughter's involvement in her account struck him as out of character. He had pulled Veronica aside during one visit and asked direct questions about why these changes were necessary, why Dorothy's longtime attorney wasn't involved, and whether Dorothy's other granddaughter, meaning me, was aware of these arrangements. Veronica had smooth answers for everything, explaining that I was too busy with my demanding career to help with these tedious tasks, that Dorothy had specifically asked for Veronica's help because they had grown so close, and that the attorney was elderly himself and not as responsive as he once was. What finally made Martin Richardson dig deeper was the timing and amount of the withdrawal attempt. Dorothy had been wheeled into surgery at 7:30 that morning. By 9:15, while she was still under anesthesia with her chest opened and surgeons working to bypass her blocked arteries, Veronica walked into the Pacific Trust Bank branch on Hawthorne Boulevard and requested an immediate withdrawal of $847,000. Not a round number like 800,000 or even 850,000, but the oddly specific sum of $847,000. This specificity would later prove crucial because it revealed that Veronica knew exactly how much was in the accessible accounts, down to the last $1,000. She had clearly been tracking every penny, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Veronica arrived at the bank dressed impeccably in a conservative navy suit, carrying a designer handbag, and projecting an air of calm authority. She presented the power of attorney documents and explained that she needed the funds immediately to cover unexpected medical expenses for Dorothy's surgery and recovery. She claimed the hospital was requiring a substantial deposit for post-surgical care in a private rehabilitation facility, and that time was of the essence. She wanted the money in the form of 3 cashier's checks, which would be much harder to trace and stop than an electronic transfer. Her performance was polished and convincing, the concerned granddaughter doing whatever necessary to ensure her beloved grandmother received the best possible care. But Martin Richardson had seen enough financial fraud in his 28 years in banking to recognize the warning signs. The timing was too convenient, the amount too precise, and the urgency too manufactured. He told Veronica he needed to verify some information and asked her to wait in the private banking office, a comfortable room with leather chairs and complimentary coffee. Then he did something that would change everything. He looked up Dorothy's account records and found my contact information listed as the secondary emergency contact, below Veronica but still accessible. He called my cell phone, and I answered on the second ring, my voice hoarse with exhaustion and worry after 7 hours of waiting for news about Grandma's surgery. When Martin explained what was happening, my first reaction was disbelief. Veronica was at the bank right now trying to withdraw Grandma's money while she was literally on the operating table? It was so brazen, so cruel, so utterly heartless that my mind struggled to process it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Then came the anger, a white-hot fury that made my hands shake as I gripped the phone. Martin was asking me questions about whether I knew about these withdrawals, whether Dorothy had discussed this with me, whether I had any documentation about Dorothy's actual wishes regarding her finances. I told him the truth, that I knew nothing about Veronica being on the accounts, that Grandma had never mentioned giving her this kind of access, and that I was certain this was not what Dorothy wanted. Martin made a decision that required real courage. He told me he was going to deny the withdrawal request pending further investigation, despite the power of attorney documents Veronica had presented. He knew this could expose the bank to liability if Veronica's papers were legitimate, but his instincts and his loyalty to Dorothy as a longtime customer outweighed his concerns about potential legal consequences. He went back to the private office where Veronica was waiting, probably checking her phone or rehearsing her next moves, and informed her that the withdrawal could not be processed immediately. There were regulatory requirements for transactions of this size, he explained, and the bank needed additional verification before releasing such a substantial sum. Veronica's composed facade cracked slightly, her voice rising as she insisted this was an emergency, that her grandmother's care depended on immediate access to these funds, that she had all the proper documentation and the bank was being unreasonable. Martin held firm, and Veronica eventually left the bank empty-handed, her fury barely contained beneath a thin veneer of professional courtesy. She called me 17 times over the next hour while I sat in that waiting room, but I didn't answer. I couldn't trust myself to speak to her without saying things that couldn't be unsaid, and I needed to focus on Grandma's surgery and figure out what to do next. The calls kept coming, then switched to text messages, each one more urgent and accusatory than the last. She claimed there had been a misunderstanding at the bank, that she was trying to help, that I was interfering with Grandma's care, that I had always been jealous of her close relationship with Dorothy. The messages painted me as the villain in a story where Veronica was the devoted caregiver and I was the bitter, suspicious granddaughter undermining her efforts. At 4:32 that afternoon, Dr. Morales finally emerged from the surgical wing, still in his scrubs, his face showing the exhaustion of a 9-hour operation. The surgery had been successful, he told me, though it had been more complicated than anticipated. They had bypassed 4 arteries instead of the expected 3, and Dorothy had lost more blood than ideal, but she was stable now and being moved to the cardiac intensive care unit. I could see her once she was settled, probably in another hour. I thanked him with tears streaming down my face, relief flooding through me so powerfully that my knees nearly buckled. Grandma Dorothy had survived. She was going to be okay. And now I had to make sure that when she woke up, her life savings would still be intact. I used that hour before I could see Grandma to make some calls of my own. First, I contacted Dorothy's longtime attorney, Howard Chin, no relation despite sharing her maiden name. Howard was 73 years old but still sharp and practicing law with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made him successful. I explained everything, the attempted withdrawal, the power of attorney documents, Veronica's suspicious behavior over the past months. Howard listened without interrupting, then asked pointed questions about specifics. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment before speaking. Jennifer, nothing you've described sounds like anything Dorothy would do. She's always been extraordinarily careful about her financial affairs and very clear about her intentions. I helped her create a comprehensive estate plan just 18 months ago, and there was no mention of giving Veronica any access to her accounts. Something is very wrong here. Howard agreed to meet me at the hospital the following morning to begin investigating the documents Veronica had used and to take steps to protect Dorothy's remaining assets. He also recommended I contact Adult Protective Services, as what I had described sounded like textbook elder financial abuse. That phrase, elder financial abuse, kept echoing in my mind. My own sister was abusing our grandmother, exploiting her declining health and vulnerability for financial gain. It was a betrayal so profound that I struggled to reconcile it with my memories of growing up together, of the sister who had braided my hair and defended me from bullies on the playground, even if our relationship had grown distant in recent years. When I finally walked into the cardiac ICU and saw Grandma Dorothy in that hospital bed, looking so small and fragile surrounded by machines and monitors and 4 lines, I felt my resolve harden into something unbreakable. She had spent her entire life fighting for what was right, breaking barriers, standing up against injustice, and building a legacy through hard work and sacrifice. I was not going to let Veronica destroy that legacy or steal the security Dorothy had worked so hard to create. Whatever it took, however long the battle lasted, I was going to protect my grandmother and make sure justice was served. Dorothy was barely conscious, drifting in and out as the anesthesia wore off, but when she saw me, her eyes focused for a moment and her lips moved slightly. I leaned close to hear her whisper. "Jennifer, you came." "Of course I came, Grandma," I told her, squeezing her hand gently. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She seemed reassured by this, closing her eyes and slipping back into medicated sleep. I sat beside her bed for hours, watching her chest rise and fall with each breath, the monitors beeping steadily, proof that her heart was still beating strong despite everything it had been through that day. While she slept, I began planning my next moves, thinking through the legal strategies I had learned in law school and practiced in my work, now applied to the most personal case of my life. The first 72 hours after surgery were critical, Dr. Morales had explained. Dorothy needed to remain stable, avoid infection, and begin the slow process of recovery. During those 3 days, I essentially lived at the hospital, leaving only for quick showers and changes of clothes at Grandma's house. Veronica tried to visit once, showing up at the ICU with flowers and a performance of concern that the nurses might have found touching if I hadn't already briefed them on the situation. I met her at the ICU entrance and made it very clear she was not welcome. The confrontation was brief and cold. Veronica tried indignation first, then tears, then anger, cycling through emotions like someone auditioning for a role. When none of it worked, when I simply stood there with my arms crossed and my expression unyielding, she finally left, throwing a parting shot over her shoulder about how I had always been controlling and that Grandma would be disappointed in how I was treating family. That night, after Veronica's visit, I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a woman's voice introduced herself as Patricia Lawson, Derek's mother and Veronica's mother-in-law. I had met her perhaps 3 times over the years at various family gatherings, a perfectly coiffed woman who spoke in careful, measured tones about appearances and propriety. Patricia's call was supposedly about checking on Dorothy's condition, but it quickly became clear she had another agenda. She began explaining, in a sympathetic voice dripping with false concern, that Veronica and Derek were facing some temporary financial difficulties. She emphasized temporary, as if that made everything better. They had made some investments that hadn't panned out, she explained, and were in a bit of a cash flow crunch, nothing serious but requiring some short-term assistance. The implication was clear: they needed money, a lot of it, and they had planned to get it from my grandmother. I listened to Patricia's careful explanation without interrupting, letting her dig her hole deeper with each sentence. When she finally finished, I responded with a calmness I didn't feel. "So what you're telling me is that my sister and her husband are in financial trouble and decided to steal from my grandmother while she was undergoing life-threatening surgery to solve their problems. Do I have that right?" Patricia's tone shifted immediately, becoming defensive. Steal is such an ugly word, Jennifer. Veronica has been caring for Dorothy, and surely she deserves some compensation for her time and effort. Besides, it's all going to be Veronica's money eventually anyway, so what difference does the timing really make? The callousness of this statement, the casual cruelty of it, took my breath away. I ended the call without another word. Through Howard Chen's investigation over the following week, the full scope of Veronica's scheme came into focus. The power of attorney documents she had used were indeed fraudulent, created by a document preparation service that operated in a legal gray area, producing official-looking paperwork without the oversight of actual attorneys. The notary stamps were real, but the notary, a woman named Lisa Fernandez, admitted under questioning that Veronica had paid her $500 to witness Dorothy's signature without actually ensuring Dorothy understood what she was signing. Lisa claimed she thought it was a legitimate family arrangement, but her willingness to accept cash payment and skip proper verification procedures showed she knew something wasn't quite right. More disturbing was what we discovered about Veronica's pattern of behavior. Bank records showed she had made numerous smaller withdrawals from Dorothy's accounts over the preceding 6 months, amounts ranging from $5,000 to $20,000, always just under the thresholds that would trigger automatic reporting or review. She had transferred funds between accounts, created confusion in the paper trail, and even forged Dorothy's signature on several checks. The total amount she had already stolen, before the attempted $847,000 withdrawal, was nearly $130,000. She had been systematically looting our grandmother's accounts, and the surgery day withdrawal was meant to be the final big score, the moment she cleaned out everything that was left in the easily accessible accounts. Howard also uncovered Veronica's motivation. She and Derek were on the verge of bankruptcy. They had invested heavily in a multi-level marketing scheme that promised enormous returns, essentially a pyramid scheme that was in the process of collapsing. They had maxed out credit cards, taken out second mortgages, and borrowed from Derek's retirement account, pouring everything into this supposed business opportunity. When it inevitably failed, they were left with crushing debt and no way to pay it back. Rather than face the consequences of their poor decisions, rather than declare bankruptcy and start over, they decided to rob an elderly woman fighting for her life. The coldness of this calculation, the willingness to prioritize their own comfort over their grandmother's security, revealed a moral bankruptcy far worse than their financial one. As Grandma Dorothy slowly regained strength in her hospital bed, completely unaware of the battle being waged over her assets and legacy, I worked with Howard to take legal action. We filed for emergency protective orders, reported the fraud to the police and adult protective services, and began the process of recovering the funds Veronica had already stolen. Each step required documentation, court filings, and hours of work, but I approached it with the same determination Grandma Dorothy had shown throughout her career. She had taught me never to back down from a fight when you're in the right, and I wasn't going to start now. What I didn't yet know was that Veronica had one more card to play, and she was going to play it in the cruelest way possible. On Dorothy's 8th day in the hospital, as she was being prepared for transfer to a rehabilitation facility, Veronica showed up with her own lawyer and a set of documents that she claimed proved Dorothy had willingly given her access to the accounts and authorized all the withdrawals. She had apparently found some disreputable attorney willing to help her construct a defense, and they were threatening to drag this case through the courts for years, tying up Dorothy's assets and draining them through legal fees. The threat was clear: back off, or watch everything get consumed in litigation. But Veronica had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated both her grandmother's meticulous nature and her younger sister's determination to see justice done. What happened next would turn the tables completely. The rehabilitation facility where Grandma Dorothy was transferred was a quiet, well-maintained place called Riverside Recovery Center, located along the Willamette River with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in natural light and offered views of the water. Dorothy was assigned to a private room on the 3rd floor, and I made sure the staff understood that Veronica was not permitted to visit under any circumstances. I provided them with a photograph of my sister and explicit instructions to call security if she attempted to enter the building. The nursing director, a compassionate woman named Sharon Kowalski, assured me they took patient safety and family conflict seriously, and that Dorothy would be protected during her stay. During those first few days at Riverside, I watched my grandmother struggle with the basics of recovery. Simple tasks like sitting up in bed, taking a few steps with a walker, Even holding a cup of water required enormous effort from someone who had always been so independent and capable. The physical therapists were patient and encouraging, but I could see the frustration in Dorothy's eyes when her body wouldn't cooperate with what her mind wanted it to do. She was a woman who had argued cases before federal judges, who had negotiated million-dollar patent deals, who had commanded respect in boardrooms full of men who initially dismissed her, and now she needed help getting to the bathroom. The indignity of it weighed heavily on her, though she tried to hide her distress behind the stoic facade she had perfected over decades of professional life. It was during the second week of her rehabilitation stay that I decided Dorothy was strong enough to hear the truth about what Veronica had done. I had been putting it off, worried that the stress might compromise her recovery, but Howard Chin convinced me that she needed to know. We couldn't make legal decisions on her behalf without her input, and more importantly, Dorothy deserved to understand what had happened and have agency in deciding how to respond. I arranged for Howard to come to the facility one afternoon when Dorothy was most alert, after her morning therapy sessions but before the exhaustion of the day fully set in. I'll never forget the look on Grandma Dorothy's face as Howard and I explained everything. We started gently, outlining how Veronica had been visiting the bank, how she had gotten herself added to the accounts, how she had been making withdrawals over several months. Dorothy listened quietly, her expression growing more troubled with each revelation. When we told her about the attempted $847,000 withdrawal during her surgery, something shifted in her eyes. It wasn't just hurt or betrayal, it was a steely determination I recognized from stories about her toughest courtroom battles. "Show me the documents," she said, her voice still weak from the surgery but carrying unmistakable authority. Howard spread out copies of the power of attorney paperwork, the bank statements showing the unauthorized withdrawals, and the forged signatures on various checks. Dorothy studied each page carefully, despite the reading glasses that kept sliding down her nose and the tremor in her hands that made holding the papers difficult. After nearly 20 minutes of silence, she looked up at us both. "This signature isn't mine," she said, pointing to one of the power of attorney documents. "I mean, it looks similar, but I can see where she traced my usual signature pattern and then tried to make it look more natural. I've been signing my name the same way for 60 years. I know every loop and curve." She pointed out subtle differences that I never would have noticed, the professional expertise of someone who had spent decades reviewing legal documents and spotting forgeries. What happened next revealed just how calculating Veronica had been. Dorothy explained that she did remember Veronica bringing her to the bank several times, and she did remember signing some documents, but Veronica had told her they were updating beneficiary information and adding safety features to protect against fraud. She kept talking about how elderly people were being scammed online, how I needed to have someone who could monitor my accounts for suspicious activity, Dorothy said, her voice shaking slightly. She showed me news articles about seniors losing their life savings to hackers and con artists. I thought I was protecting myself, not giving her permission to rob me. The manipulation had been sophisticated and cruel. Veronica had exploited Dorothy's fears about aging and vulnerability, using legitimate concerns about elder fraud to perpetrate the very crime she claimed to be preventing. She had researched the psychology of it, understanding that elderly people who feel their independence threatened are more likely to trust family members who promise to help them maintain control. It was a con game as calculated as anything professional criminals might devise, made more effective because it came from a trusted family member who knew exactly which emotional buttons to push. Howard began outlining our legal options, explaining that we could pursue both civil and criminal remedies. The civil case would focus on recovering the stolen funds and removing Veronica from any access to Dorothy's accounts. The criminal case would involve pressing charges for forgery, fraud, and elder abuse. Dorothy listened to all of this, then asked the question I had been dreading. "What about Derek? Is he involved in this too?" I had to tell her the truth, that yes, based on the evidence we had gathered, Derek had been fully aware of what Veronica was doing and had likely encouraged it given their desperate financial situation. Dorothy closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them, they were filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Veronica was such a sweet child," she said quietly, more to herself than to us. "She used to bring me dandelions from the yard, convinced they were the most beautiful flowers in the world. She would sit in my lap and make me read the same storybook over and over until she had memorized every word. When did she become someone who could do this? It was the question that had been haunting me as well. How does a person transform from an innocent child into someone capable of stealing from their own grandmother during surgery? Howard, with the wisdom of his years, offered a perspective. People change gradually, Dorothy, making small compromises with their integrity until one day they wake up unrecognizable even to themselves. It doesn't happen overnight, and it's usually not some dramatic moral collapse. It's a series of choices, each one slightly worse than the last. We decided to move forward with both civil and criminal proceedings. Dorothy was adamant about this, despite knowing it would tear the family apart and create permanent rifts. If I let this go, she said, I'm not just failing to protect myself. I'm enabling Veronica to keep making these choices, to keep hurting people. The most loving thing I can do for her right now is to hold her accountable for her actions and hope that the consequences teach her something about integrity and responsibility. It was vintage Dorothy Lawson, the woman who had never backed down from doing what was right even when it was difficult or painful. The criminal investigation moved forward with Detective Sarah Brennan from the Portland Police Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit taking the lead. Detective Brennan was in her early 40s, with short dark hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. She had worked financial crimes for 12 years and told us that elder abuse cases were among the most difficult emotionally because the betrayal came from within families. The victims often don't want to press charges because they still love the person who hurt them, she explained. But the law doesn't care about family dynamics. Theft is theft, fraud is fraud, and we're going to build the strongest case possible. Over the next several weeks, Detective Brennan conducted extensive interviews. She spoke with bank employees who had witnessed Veronica's visits, the notary who had improperly witnessed documents, neighbors who had observed Veronica's increased presence at Dorothy's home, and financial experts who analyzed the pattern of withdrawals and transfers. She also served a search warrant on Veronica and Derek's home, seizing computers, phones, and financial records. What they found in those records was damning. Email chains between Veronica and Derek discussing how to get access to the old lady's money, and debating the best timing for the big withdrawal. Text messages where Veronica joked about Dorothy's declining health making her easier to manipulate. Browser histories showing research into power of attorney laws and how to forge signatures convincingly. The evidence was overwhelming, and the district attorney's office decided to file formal charges. Veronica was charged with multiple counts of forgery, theft, elder abuse, and financial exploitation. Derek was charged as an accomplice. The day they were arrested, I was sitting with Grandma Dorothy during one of her physical therapy sessions. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Brennan, both subjects in custody. Arraignment tomorrow at 2 p.m. I showed the message to Dorothy, watching her face carefully. She nodded once, took a deep breath, and then refocused on the parallel bars she was using to practice walking. One step at a time, she said, and I wasn't sure if she was talking about physical therapy or the legal case ahead. The family reaction to the arrests was exactly the divided disaster I had anticipated. My mother, Dorothy's daughter-in-law from her brief and unhappy marriage to my father, called me screaming about how I had destroyed the family and turned everyone against each other. Never mind that Veronica had committed actual crimes, never mind that Dorothy was the victim. Somehow I was the villain for refusing to sweep it all under the rug and pretend nothing had happened. Extended family members took sides, some supporting Dorothy and me, others insisting we were overreacting and that family matters should stay private. Thanksgiving dinner that year was cancelled because half the family refused to attend if we were there, and the other half refused to attend if Veronica and Derek were there. But there were unexpected allies as well. My cousin Marcus, Veronica's younger brother whom I had barely spoken to in years, reached out to offer his support. He told me that Veronica had asked him for money 6 months earlier, spinning a story about a business opportunity that just needed a little more capital to take off. He had loaned her $15,000 that was never repaid. When he pressed her about it, she had grown angry and accused him of being unsupportive of family. Now, hearing about what she had done to Dorothy, Marcus realized his loan had probably gone to cover earlier debts and that Veronica had been running scams throughout the extended family for longer than anyone knew. Dorothy's recovery progressed steadily through the autumn months. By late October, she had graduated from a walker to a cane and was strong enough to return home with in-home nursing care for a few hours each day. I had taken a leave of absence from my job at the environmental law firm, something my boss had been understanding about given the circumstances. "Family comes first," she had said, "and you're doing important work protecting your grandmother. The firm will be here when you're ready to come back." I moved into Dorothy's guest room temporarily, wanting to be close by as she transitioned back to independent living and as the criminal case moved forward. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for early November, and I accompanied Dorothy to the courthouse, helping her navigate the stairs she still found challenging. Veronica and Derek were already there with their attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who specialized in defending white-collar criminals. I watched Veronica's face when she saw Dorothy walk in, supported by her cane but standing tall and dignified in a navy blazer and pearls. For just a moment, Veronica's composure cracked, and I saw something that might have been shame or regret flash across her features. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the blank expression she had been wearing since her arrest. The hearing itself was procedural, establishing that there was probable cause to move forward with the charges. The prosecutor presented evidence, bank records, forged documents, witness statements, and expert testimony about the pattern of financial abuse. Veronica's attorney tried to argue that this was a family misunderstanding, that his clients had believed they had permission to manage Dorothy's finances, that elderly people sometimes became confused about arrangements they had agreed to. It was exactly the defense I had expected, attempting to paint Dorothy as unreliable and confused rather than acknowledging the clear evidence of fraud. But the prosecutor was prepared with medical records and testimony from Dorothy's doctors confirming that she had been mentally sharp and competent throughout the period in question. They had statements from Howard Shen about Dorothy's meticulous financial planning and her clear intentions regarding her estate. They had the forensic analysis showing that signatures had been forged and documents had been falsified. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Morrison, listened to everything and then made her ruling. There was more than sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, and given the amount of money involved and the defendant's financial motivation, bail was set at $100,000 for each defendant. Veronica and Derek couldn't make bail immediately, which meant they spent several days in jail before Derek's parents scraped together the money for a bail bondsman. That week in custody seemed to affect Veronica profoundly. When she emerged, she looked different, thinner and more haggard, the glossy veneer of her carefully constructed image worn away. Her attorney reached out to the prosecutor's office indicating that Veronica might be interested in a plea deal. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Angela Martinez, called me to discuss whether Dorothy would be open to considering a plea agreement instead of going to trial. I brought the question to Grandma Dorothy one evening as we sat in her living room, the same room where I had spent countless childhood afternoons. She thought about it for a long time, staring at the mantelpiece where old family photos still stood in their frames, including one of Veronica at her high school graduation, beaming with pride and promise. "What would a plea deal look like?" Dorothy finally asked. I explained that Veronica would have to plead guilty to at least some of the charges, accept criminal penalties which might include jail time or probation, and agree to make full restitution of all stolen funds. In exchange, some charges might be dropped or reduced, and she could avoid the uncertainty and publicity of a trial. Dorothy surprised me with her response. "I want full restitution, and I want her to accept responsibility publicly. She needs to admit what she did, not just to a judge but to the family, to understand that actions have consequences. But I don't want her to go to prison for years. I want her to get help for whatever drove her to this, the gambling, the debt, the desperation. I want justice, Jennifer, but I also want the possibility of eventual redemption." It was such a Dorothy response, seeking accountability while leaving the door open for healing. I relayed these parameters to Angela Martinez, who said she would present them to Veronica's attorney. The negotiations took weeks, back and forth discussions about exactly which charges Veronica would plead to, what the sentencing recommendations would be, and how the restitution would be structured. Derek, facing lesser charges as an accomplice, agreed to a deal first. He would plead guilty to one count of theft and receive probation with community service, conditional on making his portion of the restitution payments. Veronica held out longer, her attorney still trying to negotiate for no jail time at all, but eventually reality set in. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and if she went to trial and lost, she could face years in prison. On a cold December morning, we returned to Judge Morrison's courtroom for the plea hearing. Veronica stood before the judge in a simple black dress, her husband Derek beside her looking pale and nervous. The judge asked her a series of questions to ensure she understood what she was pleading guilty to and that she was doing so voluntarily. Then came the moment when Veronica had to explain in her own words what she had done. She spoke quietly, her voice barely audible, admitting that she had forged documents, stolen money from her grandmother's accounts, and attempted to withdraw a large sum while her grandmother was undergoing surgery. She acknowledged that she had done these things because she was in financial trouble and saw her grandmother's money as a solution to her problems. Judge Morrison was not gentle in her response. She spoke about the particular cruelty of elder abuse, about how it violated the trust and vulnerability of people who should be able to rely on their families for protection. She talked about the premeditation evident in Veronica's actions, the months of planning and manipulation. Then she imposed the sentence: 2 years in county jail with the possibility of work release, 5 years of probation following release, mandatory financial counseling and therapy, and full restitution of $130,000 plus the $847,000 she had attempted to steal, to be paid according to a court-approved schedule. It was a serious sentence, though not as harsh as it could have been if we had gone to trial and Veronica had been convicted on all charges. As the bailiffs led Veronica away to begin serving her sentence, she turned back and her eyes met Dorothy's across the courtroom. My grandmother sat straight-backed in the gallery, her face composed but her hand gripping mine tightly. Veronica's mouth moved, forming words I couldn't quite hear, but Dorothy nodded slightly in acknowledgement. Later, when I asked what Veronica had said, Dorothy told me it was simply, "I'm sorry, Grandma." 2 words that couldn't undo the damage but perhaps represented the first small step toward taking responsibility. The aftermath of the plea deal brought unexpected complications. Veronica's conviction meant she lost her real estate license, one of the few legitimate income sources she had maintained. Derek's company fired him when they learned about his criminal record, even though he had received probation rather than jail time. Their house went into foreclosure, and they lost both of their leased vehicles. Derek's parents, who had been so eager to defend them initially, now distanced themselves, embarrassed by the public scandal and the damage to their social standing. Patricia, Derek's mother, who had called me trying to justify Veronica's actions, sent a terse note to Dorothy apologizing for her earlier statements and essentially cutting ties with her son and daughter-in-law. For Dorothy and me, the legal resolution brought some closure but also opened up questions about what came next. The restitution payments were structured to come primarily from liquidating Veronica and Derek's remaining assets, then through wage garnishment once Veronica was released and able to work again. Howard Shin helped Dorothy create even stronger protections around her accounts and estate, including a revocable trust that would make it much harder for anyone to manipulate her assets in the future. We also worked with Pacific Trust Bank to establish additional safeguards, multiple levels of verification required for large withdrawals, mandatory notifications to both Howard and me for any changes to account access, and regular reviews of all account activity. But there was also grief to process, the loss of the family relationships we had once known or hoped to have. Dorothy grieved for the granddaughter Veronica had been and might have remained. I grieved for the sister I had wanted to have, even if I was honest with myself about the fact that Veronica and I had never been particularly close. There was anger too, a simmering resentment that would flare up at unexpected moments when I thought about what Veronica had put Dorothy through, the violation of trust, the cruelty of timing the theft for when Dorothy was most vulnerable. Working through these emotions became part of both our healing processes. Dorothy started attending a support group for victims of financial fraud and elder abuse, something I had suggested hesitantly, worried she might find it depressing or beneath her dignity. Instead, she found it empowering. "These are people who understand," she told me after her first meeting. "They know what it's like to be betrayed by family, to have that fundamental trust violated. I don't have to explain or justify my feelings to them." She became a vocal advocate within the group, using her legal background to help others navigate the justice system and sharing her story as a cautionary tale about warning signs to watch for. As winter turned to spring, Dorothy's physical recovery reached the point where she no longer needed in-home nursing care. She was walking without the cane most days, had returned to her beloved garden even if the heavy digging now had to be hired out, and was cooking meals that filled her house with the familiar aromas of my childhood. Her cardiac rehab team was thrilled with her progress, and her cardiologist told us that she was exceeding all the recovery benchmarks for someone her age. "Your grandmother is tough as nails," he said with genuine admiration. "I've seen people half her age give up and become invalids after surgery like this. She's determined to not just survive but to thrive." I had been preparing to return to work at the law firm, feeling that Dorothy was stable enough that I didn't need to be there every day. But Dorothy surprised me with a different proposal. She wanted to start a non-profit organization focused on elder abuse prevention and education, and she wanted me to run it. "You've seen firsthand what happens when families don't know the warning signs," she said. "You have the legal expertise and the passion for justice. We could make a real difference, help other elderly people protect themselves and teach families how to have difficult conversations about aging and finances before crisis hits." The idea took root in my mind, growing from an interesting possibility into a calling that felt right in a way my environmental law work never quite had. Working with Dorothy, we developed a business plan for what would become the Dorothy Lawson Institute for Elder Protection. Dorothy provided the initial funding from her recovered assets, viewing it as a way to transform her painful experience into something positive. We recruited a board of directors including Howard Chin, Detective Brennan, a geriatric social worker, and several other professionals who worked with elderly populations. We rented office space in a building with good accessibility features and began developing educational programs and resources. Our first major project was creating a comprehensive guide for families about financial planning and protection for aging relatives. It covered everything from how to have conversations about estate planning to recognizing signs of cognitive decline that might make elderly people vulnerable to exploitation, whether from strangers or family members. We included Dorothy's story, with her permission, as a real-world example of how someone intelligent and competent could still fall victim to manipulation when dealing with health crises and family pressure. The guide was distributed free through senior centers, hospitals, and community organizations throughout Oregon. We also developed a legal clinic where elderly people could come for free consultations about protecting their assets and creating appropriate estate plans. Howard Chin volunteered his time one afternoon a week, and we recruited other elder law attorneys to join the rotation. The response was overwhelming, appointment slots filling up months in advance as word spread about the resource. Many of the people who came had stories similar to Dorothy's, adult children or other relatives pressuring them about finances, making them feel like they were losing their competence, isolating them from other family members who might question what was happening. One case that particularly stayed with me involved an 86-year-old man named Walter who came to our clinic in the early summer. His daughter had moved into his house supposedly to care for him, but she had taken over his bedroom, forced him to sleep in a small guest room, and was slowly selling off his possessions to fund her drug habit. Walter was embarrassed to admit what was happening, whispering his story as if confessing to some shameful secret rather than describing his own victimization. Dorothy happened to be at the office that day and sat down with Walter, sharing her own story and assuring him that seeking help was not weakness but courage. By the end of the consultation, Walter had agreed to let us help him take legal action to remove his daughter from his home and get her into treatment. These successes gave Dorothy a sense of purpose that seemed to add years back to her life. She was vibrant and engaged in a way I hadn't seen since before her health crisis. She gave speeches at conferences about elder abuse, consulted with lawmakers on proposed legislation to strengthen protections, and became a media spokesperson on the issue, her dignified presence and articulate explanations making complex legal concepts accessible to general audiences. Local news stations would call when they needed expert comment on elder abuse stories, and Dorothy was always willing to participate if it meant raising awareness. Meanwhile, Veronica was serving her sentence at the county jail's women's facility. I didn't visit her, wasn't ready for that step, but Dorothy went once a month like clockwork. She never told me much about those visits except that they were difficult but necessary. "She's my granddaughter," Dorothy would say when I questioned whether these visits were too emotionally taxing. "I'm holding her accountable for what she did, but I'm not abandoning her entirely. There's a difference." Through Dorothy, I learned that Veronica was attending the jail's addiction counseling programs and financial literacy classes, that she seemed to be genuinely trying to understand what had led her to make such destructive choices. Derek, on probation and working a minimum wage job to make his restitution payments, had apparently fallen apart without Veronica's stronger personality to lean on. He moved back in with his parents, who made their disappointment in him abundantly clear. He attended his required counseling sessions and made his payments on time, but there was a brokenness to him that suggested the consequences had thoroughly destroyed whatever illusions of easy money and quick success had driven him to participate in the fraud. His mother Patricia sent Dorothy a formal letter of apology, taking responsibility for her earlier defense of the indefensible and praising Dorothy for her strength and dignity throughout the ordeal. As summer turned to fall and we approached the one-year anniversary of Dorothy's surgery, I found myself reflecting on how completely life had changed. A year ago, I had been a mid-level attorney at an environmental firm, going through the motions of a career I had chosen more because it seemed respectable than because it truly fulfilled me. Now I was running a nonprofit that was making measurable differences in people's lives, working alongside my grandmother who had become not just family but a true professional colleague. The pain of what Veronica had done would never completely disappear, but it had been transformed into something productive and meaningful. Dorothy's garden had never looked better, the fall flowers she had planted in spring now blooming in vibrant oranges and deep purples. We were in the garden together one Saturday afternoon when she brought up Veronica's upcoming release. She would be eligible for work release in another month, meaning she could leave the jail during the day for employment but would have to return each night. Dorothy was considering hiring Veronica to do administrative work for the Institute, subject to strict oversight and boundaries. I was skeptical, worried it would be too much stress for Dorothy or that Veronica might take advantage again, but Dorothy had clearly thought it through carefully. She needs a chance to rebuild, Dorothy explained, and working for an organization focused on preventing the very crime she committed might be therapeutic. It would be supervised, it would be honest work, and it would help her make the restitution payments more quickly. I'm not doing this to be a martyr, Jennifer. I'm doing it because the data shows that people who find meaningful employment after incarceration are much less likely to reoffend. I'm thinking practically about breaking the cycle. It was hard to argue with her logic, though I insisted on strict conditions including no access to any financial accounts, no unsupervised time in the office, and immediate termination if there was any indication of dishonesty. What I didn't know was that Dorothy had been working on something else, something she was planning to reveal at a family gathering she had organized for Thanksgiving. Despite all the division and pain, despite the fact that half the family wasn't speaking to the other half, Dorothy had sent out invitations to everyone, including those who had sided with Veronica initially. She framed it as a healing event, a chance to come together and move forward. I was doubtful many people would come, but I underestimated both Dorothy's persuasive powers and the family's curiosity about what she had planned. When Thanksgiving Day arrived, I was shocked to see nearly 30 relatives gathered in Dorothy's living room, the same room where so many painful confrontations had occurred over the past year. Dorothy stood before this assembled group, leaning slightly on her cane but projecting the same authority she had commanded in courtrooms decades earlier. She spoke about the past year, acknowledging the pain and division, the betrayal and the consequences. Then she did something unexpected. She announced that she was creating a family financial literacy fund, money specifically set aside to provide education and counseling to any family member who wanted to learn better money management, investment strategies, or debt counseling. It would be supervised by Howard Chen and available to anyone who acknowledged they needed help, with no judgment or shame attached. What happened with Veronica didn't occur in a vacuum, Dorothy said. Our family, like many families, doesn't talk openly about money. We don't teach our children financial responsibility. We don't acknowledge when we're struggling until it becomes a crisis. This fund is my attempt to address that systemic problem. I want every person in this family to have access to the knowledge and resources they need to make sound financial decisions and avoid the desperation that leads people to make terrible choices. The room was silent, people processing this unexpected generosity from someone who had every right to be bitter and closed off. But Dorothy wasn't finished. She also announced that she was working with Howard to create a family trust that would provide for future generations, but with very specific conditions. Beneficiaries would have to complete financial education programs, demonstrate responsible money management, and commit to supporting other family members who were struggling, not with money necessarily but with time, guidance, and tough love when needed. I want my legacy to be more than just money passed down, she said. I want it to be the values and skills that help this family thrive for generations. The gathering ended with tears and awkward but genuine conversations between people who had been avoiding each other for months. It wasn't complete reconciliation, wounds this deep don't heal that quickly, but it was a start. As people were leaving, my cousin Marcus pulled me aside. "Your grandmother is remarkable," he said. "After everything that happened, she's still thinking about the good of the family. I'm ashamed I didn't stand up for her sooner, that I believed Veronica's lies for even a moment." I told him what Dorothy had taught me, that we can't change the past but we can choose how we move forward, and that his support now mattered more than his initial doubts. As the last guest left and I helped Dorothy clean up, she sat down heavily on the couch, exhaustion finally showing on her face. "That took more out of me than I expected," she admitted. "But it needed to be done. Veronica's release is coming soon, and I wanted the family to be prepared, to understand that I'm choosing forgiveness over perpetual anger, but that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or failing to maintain boundaries." I sat beside her, this extraordinary woman who had survived heart surgery, theft, family betrayal, and had somehow emerged stronger and more compassionate rather than bitter and broken. "How do you do it, Grandma?" I asked. "How do you keep choosing hope and healing when it would be so much easier to just shut everyone out and protect yourself?" She thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "Because the alternative is to let what Veronica did define the rest of my life, to become a victim in my own story. I refuse to give her that power. I'm choosing to write the ending myself, and it's going to be about transformation and purpose, not just pain." Her words stayed with me as I drove home that night, and I realized that I had been given a master class not just in legal strategy or nonprofit management, but in resilience and grace under the worst circumstances. What remained to be seen was how Veronica would respond to the opportunity Dorothy was offering, and whether the justice that had been served would ultimately lead to genuine redemption or simply to compliance with court orders. The next chapter of this family story was about to unfold, and none of us knew yet exactly what it would hold. Veronica's work release began on a crisp November morning, and I met her at the Institute's office to go over expectations and boundaries. She looked different from the polished, confident woman who had walked into Pacific Trust Bank a year earlier. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, no expensive highlights or salon styling. She wore plain clothes from a thrift store, the designer labels and luxury brands gone along with everything else she had lost. Most noticeably, her eyes had changed. The calculating sharpness had been replaced by something more uncertain, almost fragile. We sat in the small conference room, and I laid out the rules clearly. She would handle filing, data entry, and basic administrative tasks. She would have no access to financial information, client records, or anything involving money. She would be supervised at all times, either by me or by our office manager, Patricia. Any violation of trust, no matter how small, would result in immediate termination and reporting to her probation officer. Veronica listened without interrupting, nodding at each point, and when I finished, she simply said, "I understand. Thank you for giving me this chance." The first few weeks were awkward for everyone. Veronica worked quietly and efficiently, never complaining about the mundane tasks assigned to her. She arrived exactly on time each morning and left promptly when her work release hours ended to return to the jail facility. She didn't try to engage in personal conversations or make excuses for what she had done. The other staff members were professional but distant, aware of her history and understandably wary. I watched her carefully, looking for any signs of manipulation or dishonesty, but saw only someone trying to rebuild from absolute bottom. Dorothy visited the office during Veronica's second week, and I witnessed their interaction with a mix of hope and protective concern. They spoke briefly in Dorothy's private office, and when they emerged, both had been crying. Dorothy looked emotionally exhausted but also somehow lighter, as if a burden had been partially lifted. Veronica returned to her desk and worked with even more focus than before, her hands shaking slightly as she organized files. Later, Dorothy told me that Veronica had apologized again, more completely this time, acknowledging the full extent of what she had done and the pain she had caused. As winter settled over Portland, bringing rain and gray skies, something unexpected began happening. Veronica started contributing ideas during staff meetings about how to reach more people with our educational programs. She suggested partnering with churches and community centers in lower-income neighborhoods where people might not have access to legal resources. She proposed creating simplified materials for people with limited English proficiency, drawing on her experience in marketing to make complex legal concepts more accessible. Her suggestions were good, genuinely helpful, and I found myself grudgingly impressed despite my lingering distrust. The real turning point came in January when an elderly woman named Helen came to our legal clinic in severe distress. Her nephew had convinced her to sign over her small house, using tactics nearly identical to what Veronica had employed with Dorothy. Helen was distraught, feeling foolish and ashamed, blaming herself for being too trusting. Our volunteer attorney was tied up with another client, and I was about to step in when Veronica quietly asked if she could speak with Helen first, just to gather basic information. I hesitated, every protective instinct screaming that this was a terrible idea, but something in Veronica's expression made me agree. I watched through the glass door as Veronica sat with Helen, listening intently as the older woman told her story. Then Veronica did something I didn't expect. She shared her own story, explaining that she had committed the same type of fraud against her own grandmother, that she understood the manipulation tactics because she had used them herself. She told Helen that what happened wasn't Helen's fault, that the people who commit these crimes are skilled at exploiting trust and family bonds. Helen's entire demeanor changed. The shame and self-blame lifted as she realized she hadn't been foolish. She had been targeted by someone using sophisticated psychological manipulation. By the time our attorney was available, Helen was composed and clear-headed, able to provide detailed information about what had happened. The attorney later told me it was one of the most productive initial consultations she had conducted, that having someone who understood the perpetrator's mindset had been invaluable in quickly identifying the key legal issues. After that day, Veronica's role at the Institute began to evolve. We started having her participate in educational presentations, not as a representative of the organization but as someone with unique insight into how financial exploitation happens. She spoke at senior centers and community groups, always introducing herself honestly as someone who had committed elder abuse and served time for it. Her presentations were powerful because she could describe the warning signs from the perspective of someone who had deliberately created them, explaining the tactics and thought processes that family members use to justify stealing from their own relatives. The feedback from these presentations was overwhelmingly positive. People appreciated the brutal honesty, the insider knowledge that helped them recognize danger they might otherwise miss. Veronica was careful never to make excuses or minimize what she had done, always emphasizing that understanding why people commit these crimes didn't excuse the behavior. She spoke about the progression from small financial boundary violations to major theft, about how desperation and poor choices compound until you're doing things you never imagined yourself capable of. Dorothy attended one of these presentations, sitting quietly in the back of the community center as Veronica spoke to a room full of elderly people and their adult children. Watching my grandmother listen to her granddaughter describe manipulating and stealing from her, using their relationship as a cautionary tale, was almost unbearable. But Dorothy's face showed something I hadn't expected, not pain but a kind of fierce pride. After the presentation, she approached Veronica and embraced her for the first time since the arrest. "You're doing important work," Dorothy said quietly. "You're taking the worst thing you've ever done and using it to protect others. That takes real courage." Veronica completed her work release program in March and transitioned to full probation, which meant she could live outside the jail facility. She rented a tiny studio apartment in a modest neighborhood, furnished it with donations and thrift store finds, and continued working at the Institute now as a regular employee. She attended therapy twice a week, participated in a financial recovery program for people rebuilding after bankruptcy, and made her restitution payments religiously. Derek had divorced her while she was incarcerated, unable to handle the shame and consequences of what they had done together. She signed the papers without contest, acknowledging that the relationship had been built on shared delusions about easy money and status. The Dorothy Lawson Institute continued to grow, helping hundreds of families navigate the complex intersection of aging, family dynamics, and financial protection. We expanded our services to include support groups for victims of family financial abuse, many of them elderly people dealing with the same feelings of betrayal and shame that Dorothy had experienced. Veronica became a regular facilitator for these groups, her presence offering proof that both healing and accountability were possible. On the second anniversary of Dorothy's surgery, we held a celebration at the Institute to mark how far we had all come. The office was filled with people whose lives had been changed by the work we were doing, elderly clients who had been protected from exploitation, family members who had learned to have difficult conversations before crisis hit, and volunteers who donated their time to the cause. Dorothy gave a short speech, talking about how pain could be transformed into purpose, how the worst betrayal of her life had ultimately led to work that gave her more meaning than anything in her long and successful career. Veronica also spoke briefly, thanking Dorothy for the opportunity to make amends through action rather than just words, for refusing to let her be defined solely by her worst choices. She talked about the long road of rebuilding trust and how it required consistent demonstration over time, not grand gestures or emotional appeals. She acknowledged that some family members would never forgive her, and that she had to accept that consequence while continuing to do better each day. As I watched them stand side by side, this remarkable woman who had survived so much and the granddaughter who had betrayed her so terribly, I understood something profound about justice and grace. Real accountability meant more than punishment. It meant transformation, taking responsibility not just in words but in how you lived your life going forward. Veronica would spend years making restitution payments and rebuilding trust, and some relationships might never be fully restored. But she was doing the work, showing up every day to help protect others from people like she had been, using her knowledge of manipulation to arm potential victims with awareness. Dorothy had chosen to make space for that redemption while never minimizing what had been done to her, holding both accountability and possibility in the same hands. The Institute became Dorothy's true legacy, more enduring than any amount of money she might have left in a traditional inheritance. It stood as proof that even our deepest wounds could become sources of healing for others, that families could survive betrayal and find new ways of relating to each other, that justice and mercy weren't opposites but partners in the work of making things right. As we stood together that evening, surrounded by the community we had built from the ashes of theft and betrayal, I felt grateful for the hard lessons learned and the strength it had revealed in my grandmother and even, surprisingly, in my sister. The garden Dorothy had maintained for decades continued to bloom each spring, and she often said the same was true for families. With proper care, attention to warning signs, and willingness to do the difficult work of healing, even relationships damaged by profound betrayal could find new life. Not the same as before, but perhaps something deeper and more resilient for having survived the worst and chosen to grow anyway. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.